Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Third Space Podcast, episode 59, Extrawordal Communication. I actually used the phrase in the episode this time. It's not as funny as before, but that's okay. At least I tied the title to the episode. In this episode, Daniel brings to the table some interesting topics on language. He's been reading Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, which is a book, I gather, a piece of literature containing information about words, written in words, and so on. And so there's an idea that Gladwell presents about how people who speak in a different language, Chinese, for example, can remember a greater number of digits than we can when we speak English. And so Daniel and I discuss that idea and related ideas about language and memory. Of course, that leads us into talking about differences in language and culture and speculating on why and how some of these differences might have come to be. We talk about aliens and how aliens with certain morphology might have a different language. It's all speculation, of course, but I thought it was very interesting. We talk a lot about how language develops, some quirks of particular languages and how it might affect behavior, nonverbal communication, aka extrawordal communication. And then we talk at the very end a little bit about AI and AI translation and how that might affect all of the different things we talked about. I thought it was a very fun conversation. To me, it felt like we definitely got into third space, so I hope you will come along for the ride. Enjoy.
Third Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast, Third Space Podcast.
Hello. All right. Jinx. You owe me a soda.
You owe me a soda.
Oh, great minds. Thinking a similar
fashion. Hey.
Oh. Good times on the Third Space Podcast.
You know, that's funny, like starting off with the same words. I've been thinking about words a lot, Bennett.
You mean, have you been thinking about words or have you been thinking in words?
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it. Like, I think we generally conceptualize thought, like we have thoughts and then we put them into words. Like we have this internal thing that needs to get out, and that's what words do, is they allow the inside abstraction to like be verbalized and articulated with words.
The inwards, they allow your inwards to become outwards.
Words. yeah, out.
Would a baby on Baby Island think in words?
I think eventually they would want to develop a language. I mean, I think you have two ways to communicate, physically and verbally. And so, is that fair to say? Is there another way?
Telepathically.
I'm just saying, okay, this is what I think, is that if we have nonverbal communication, so that can take the form of dance, let's say,
body language, facial
competition. Yeah. But like it's just, and it's all physical, right? Like it's this way of communicating. But words, there's some precision with that. And I would actually, my hypothesis is that the more educated you are, the more able you are to articulate the precise inward feelings, that the more comfortable you get and the less need you have for the physical expression. And I think you look at the uneducated, frustrated, like we'll just take a redneck stereotype who goes to the bars and gets in bar fights. They're probably not, I mean, there's probably a few people that just enjoy fights, like that's a thrill. But more often than not, I would say that they live a frustrating life. They feel misunderstood, and they just can't quite put it into words for others, or perhaps even for themselves. And so the power of education and the power of expanding your language, you feel understood by the world and by yourself, and you don't need to express yourself quite as physically. I mean, I do think physical expression is still powerful through like various like competitions and you know, on all the nonverbal, super important too. I don't want to understate that. What are your thoughts?
Do you think that even the English language is up to the task of characterizing the inward feelings and the complex psychology that, you know, the redneck at the bar might experience, and all the different problems that he might have going on that contribute to his frustration? What I'm asking, I guess, is the difference between, let's say that, you know, your stereotypical redneck goes into the bar and sits down, he's frustrated, and then your ivory tower academic decides to go into the same bar for whatever reason, and he sits down, and they both have, you know, some frustrations, and they want to express the frustrations, both of them, naturally.
Yes.
That's where their frustration comes from. Can the redneck guy get to, you know, because of his supposed lack of education, can he only get to 20% expression, whereas the academic can get to, you know, 99%? Or can the redneck get to 15% and the academic can get to 20%? Like, what's the discrepancy here? That's what I'm trying to ask.
Well, I think you're right in assuming that language falls short of all of the immense psychology that is contained within ourselves. Like, we're infinitely complex, and language is finite. And like, I mean, I guess we're finitely complex if we're being realistic. But I do think words and language are representative of ideas, and so that they can't perfectly be the ideas themselves, which is it's a weird thought. It's a weird series of words. Mm-hmm. I think that I'm just gonna, if you're asking for me to spitball numbers, yeah, I think the uneducated redneck is able to get out 25-30%, and because they can say things like, I am unhappy with my wife, or they can just say, I'm mad at the world, or they can, their basic linguistic value is there. And then I think the educated elite professor person is able to communicate maybe 75-80%, can really talk about like both structural injustices and that have dispossessed him and whatever, and be really articulate in his critique.
How much of the percentage, well, you say the frustration comes from not being understood. Well, to be understood, it's not a one-man job, right? It's the person communicating and the person perceiving the communication, listening to the communication. So, you know, how much of the barrier is in whoever is receiving the communication? The bartender, for example. You know, would the bartender really be able to understand the communication coming from the redneck and from the academic to the same degree?
So
and
this is an interesting
a secondary question. Even if you have the vocabulary, let's say, or the education, or the breadth of reading, you know, to have seen words in their particular context, does that make you able to understand your own feelings and experiences enough to communicate them?
Well, yeah, I think people hang around with not only like-minded people, but similarly articulate people for a reason. I think that I'm speculating wildly here that rednecks, it's such polarizing terms, but the rednecks sort of claim to understand one another, and perhaps do because they have a similar walk in life. So they just go, dang it, my wife, you know, and the other one goes, yeah, women. And it's not a particularly articulate thing, but given the probably common experiences, they kind of nod in agreement. And maybe that's just enough. Even if it's a faux understanding, it's still a suggestion of, hey, brother, I'm on your side. And this is sort of where loyalty, a culture of honor, kind of gets folded in. Like, we get it. We're in the trenches together. We're the downtrodden. And so it doesn't even matter if they actually understand one another, but the suggestion that they are understood is enough. And I think that, so there's that. And then I think the culturally elite, the educated, pompous people, they have they have a shared collective body of ideas, phrases, sophisticated jargon in the world, and that they probably have both experienced. So when they say something like, "Oh, are you familiar with the superior wharf hypothesis?" Yes, it's like, and they these ideas have already been articulated, so they don't have to. So they can play with these abstract ideas and go further in at least intellectual understanding. I'm not saying that I would also say that they're not any more or less lonely. My guess is the culturally elite don't feel any more connected and theoretically could feel less connected, right? They go and they have these intellectual exchanges, and that might not feel as good as the other one just sort of, nodding at you from across the bar and going, "Yeah, I get it, man." Like that actually might forge some sort of bond that, the faux understanding there might be more satisfying to the redneck potentially.
I'm not sure I'm comfortable calling it faux understanding. I don't know that I'm on board with what you're presenting here. Totally.
What I'm saying is like that there it can be a singular line of expression, like, "Been a rough day at work," and the other one goes, "Yeah, I get you,"
Well,
and like,
and so do you think that "yeah, I get you" is a lie, or
no,
or what?
I think there's just such profound assumptions in that "I get you," because you have not said anything about why it was a tough day at work. You don't know the intricacies. You didn't bother articulating all the nuance. You've just made the big grand statement of "it's been rough," and the other one says, "I understand what that means. I know what roughness
Okay,
means."
so let's say the academic comes in and sits at the bar and says, "Oh, I'm experiencing systemic oppression." And that's all he says, right? And
Yeah.
do you expect someone to understand that?
That's why they would surround themselves with someone else who goes, "Yeah, or said, "I'm tired of this bureaucratic red tape in the office." Like, so, and then someone else who has had a similar path, who understands bureaucratic red tape, and says, "Yeah, at my job," and they actually, so the intellectuals are more likely to get granular and start exploring quickly and sharing ideas, like talk a lot more, frankly, use their words more often and more descriptive and more accurately. And then you got the rednecks who are just sort of, I mean, of course this is all a wild, but still, you got the rednecks who just kind of go, "Man." And then, like, almost this king of the hill, like, "Yep," they're standing around and they're just going, "Mm-hmm," and like, and there's just this shared camaraderie because there didn't.
See, I think it's more than shared camaraderie. I think in all of these little cultural niches that you're presenting, there's much more to communication and understanding than simply the words being vocalized. I think that shared cultural space, that all of the rednecks have experienced issues with their women, and the tractors and whatever else. They've all had problems in this way, and so you
Sweet
don't
tea without enough sugar in it.
you don't yeah you don't actually have to articulate exactly what's going on in order to be understood. That understanding can actually be achieved because of the common background. And I think the same can be said for the academics. You don't have to actually articulate the whys and the hows and essentially verbalize an academic paper in order to be understood. You can just say, "being systemically oppressed today," and all the academics know what you're talking about, and they fill in the blanks, and you're all on the same page. Now, that's me pushing back against some of what you're presenting. I think, and you know that I'm a big fan of words. I enjoy words. I use them sometimes. I have
Frequently.
I have adventures in etymology, so I have an appreciation for the language. If I had to try to articulate what the value of a detailed and specific language would be, it's to communicate across those barriers, right? Like, and in writing in particular. So if the academic is trying to talk to the redneck or vice versa, it's important that they have a common language and a detailed language that can try to capture the depth of experience to the highest degree possible between them.
Yes.
Or when you're writing something, when you're putting something down on paper, you don't know who your audience is, and you don't know if you're going to share these cultural ties, and of course writing across time. That's a whole other thing, right? Like when we read things that were written in the 1800s or Shakespeare, or even older, like it's harder for us to understand because we don't share all of the same cultural or temporal ties to the author. So I definitely see the I see the value. I'm not trying to say that no, language isn't important, because people can go in the King of the Hill fashion. I'm not saying that, but I do think a lot of communication is outside of the words, extrawordular, as they say.
Extrawordular. Well, yeah, nonverbal communication is people say like only 30% of communication are the words themselves or something like that. I'm pulling that out, but it was some way smaller percentage. You would think it'd be 95 or something like that, but it's actually significantly lower than 50, and
right.
that's surprising. But also then things like culture, the same words can land differently to different people. And I really liked your framing of how words are an attempt to go cross-cultural. Obviously we have different languages, but you can quote translate them. And then where does that get messy, and does that mess things up? And I've been thinking a lot about,
like, if you've ever talked to someone who speaks English as a second language, even though their vocabulary may be somewhat broad and they use words that you wouldn't expect an elementary schooler to use, you would expect a higher educated person to use those words. There are other little ways that they combine words and parts of speech that clue you in very quickly that they're not a native English speaker. And it's kind of fascinating. Those differences are kind of fascinating to me anyway.
And then the question is learning, what are those differences? Because it's clearly not, language doesn't just map as a perfect translation. There's different cultural expressions, idiomatic expressions. There's different. What I'm curious about is how it also affects memory, and this is a perfect segue. Actually, I just finished reading Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and I have a section of the book I want to read to you. And ultimately, it's a page or two, but it's about how our memory is impacted through language. Because we started off talking about how we have these thoughts inside of us, right? That's how I started off. We have these thoughts inside us and we put it into words. But then the question is, how do the words actually shape our thought? Because it's a two-way street. It's not just one way. And
some people say. Isn't that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
That is the support. It's the question of to what extent do the words shape thought.
My understanding is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is widely regarded as essentially bunk now. It's not widely accepted anymore in cognitive science.
There are a few tales about Eskimos have 50 different words for snow, and that's not entirely accurate. So they were stories people developed. But the idea that words shape thought that's pretty unequivocally, that's not really debated. Words do shape thought, but to what extent is the question. Well, this is a good example. I will give you. I have two good examples, but they will impact the way you catalog. If something happens to you and you want to retain it and put it into memory, and you do that through the use of language. Well, the way your culture's language is constructed might impact the memory. So when you go back and retrieve it might be a little bit different. I have two great examples from two different sources, but this one's from Outliers. I'll read it to you now.
Okay.
All right.
I hope I can
take
understand.
a look at. I think you will. I practice reading it, but I'm also scared to read out loud over the podcast. I've never done this before, so let's see how my practicing did. All right. Take a look at the following list of numbers: 4, 8, 5, 3, 9, 7, 6. Read them out loud. Now look away and spend 20 seconds memorizing that sequence before saying them out loud again. If you speak English, you have about a 50% chance of remembering that sequence perfectly. If you're Chinese, though, you're almost certain to get it right every time. Why is that? Because as human beings, we store digits in a memory loop that runs for about 2 seconds. We most easily memorize whatever we can say or read within that 2-second span. And Chinese speakers get that list of numbers 4, 8, 5, 3, 9, 7, 6 right almost every time because, unlike English, their language allows them to fit all those 7 numbers into 2 seconds. Chinese number words are remarkably brief. Most of them can be uttered in less than 1/4 of a second. For instance, 4 is C and 7 Qi or QI. Their English equivalents 4, 7 are longer. Pronouncing them takes about 1/3 of a second. The memory gap between English and Chinese apparently is entirely due to this difference in length. In languages as diverse as Welsh, Arabic, Chinese, English, and Hebrew, there is a reproducible correlation between the time required to pronounce numbers in a given language and the memory span of its speakers. In this domain, the prize for efficacy goes to the Cantonese dialect of Chinese, whose brevity grants residents of Hong Kong a rocketing memory span of about 10 digits. It turns out that there is also a big difference in how number naming systems in Western and Asian languages are constructed. In English, we say 14, 16, 17, 18, and 19, and so one might expect that we would also say 1-teen, 2-teen, 3-teen, and 5-teen, but we don't. We use a different form, 11, 12, 13, and 15. Similarly, we have 40 and 60, which sound like the words they are related to, 4 and 6. But we also say 50 and 30 and 20, which sort of sound like 5 and 3 and 2, but not really. And for that matter, for numbers above 20, we put the decade first and the unit number second, 21, 22, whereas for the teens, we do it for the other way around, 14, 17, 18. The number system in English is highly irregular. Not so in China, Japan, and Korea. They have a logical counting system. 11 is 10-1, 12 is 10-2, 24 is 2 10s 4, and so on. That difference means that Asian children learn to count much faster than American children. 4-year-old Chinese children can count on average to 40. American children at that age can only count to 15, and most don't reach 40 until they're 5. By the age of 5, in other words, American children are already a year behind their Asian counterparts in the most fundamental of math skills.
Can I ask, can I interject a thought?
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that distinction is truly because of these verbal and categorizational, they're not even really categorizational differences, but just slight verbal differences, and how much is cultural. I mean, there's a lot of talk in recent years about the achievement differences between Asian students and American students in the college system, and there's a clear distinction, right? And not even just college, in high school as well. There's a clear difference in the average achievement of Asian students and all other students, essentially.
Right.
And can we attribute all of that to the fact that 20 is called 20 instead of 210? No. I don't think so anyway. I find this very interesting and I think there's something to it. I just wonder if all of the discrepancy can be explained by, counting instead of what are almost certainly significant cultural differences in the value of education.
And there certainly are. In fact, this chapter talks about the value of education and the time spent. That's another component within this very chapter, actually, is the amount of time and exposure. So we sort of grew up with American values of it even talks about rice paddies and how the more you cultivate rice, apparently, the more you spend time with it, the more it yields, and because there wasn't a lot of land, you have to get really, really good at the land you do have to cultivate. So you're just constantly refining, and the details actually matter. Whereas Americans, you don't want to over cultivate land. We're not just doing rice paddy stuff. We're doing all sorts of things. And if you over cultivate, then you you can ruin the crops, and you don't have to get really good. You have land to spread out, so it's more about getting machinery and spreading out. And so the
And
specifics, the details don't matter as much. So we actually have an analogous schooling system where we don't want to over-educate the kids; they'll burn out. We need lots of time off. And like the Japanese were like, no, like their proverbs, their colloquial expressions, their idiomatic expressions were like, hey, 360 days a year of work, like that. They're just, you can read their proverbs and stuff. It's like, wow. Whereas we say things like, you need to rest. And well, at least that's how it initially started. We're not American culture isn't exactly chill or anything like that. But yeah,
another
there's
potential
deep cultural differences.
Another potential cultural difference is if you wanted to try to think about trade-offs, for example, like, whereas that what you presented might explain culturally the high importance placed on attention to detail and repetition, and you tried to present perhaps a reason why in Western culture, American in particular, that attention to detail might not be as highly prioritized. I think you could also try to draw a distinction between innovation and creativity. Like, our culture doesn't necessarily focus on attention to detail so much, but obviously we're highly known for independence, innovation, creativity, and Eastern cultures are, well, not exactly known as much for that. Like, to take the example of China in particular, like, and obviously there are a ton of things that factor into something like this, but they're not known for innovation at all. They're known for copying what Americans do, by and large. Like and so I think that probably a lot of the truth is in the pudding, as they say, and a lot of what we observe is probably a reflection of those underlying cultural values, either an attention to detail and a value placed on community, or a heavy value placed on independence, innovation, and individuality, and both have pros and cons.
I mean, I think you're totally right, but what the entirety of Outliers impressed upon me, that I would have assumed some small difference. Okay, big deal. American children are a year behind at 4 years old, right? Like, in terms of basic fundamental math, and maybe you can directly attribute that to language. I figured that would level out very quickly, but the book makes a very convincing case that what you have early on in life kind of has outsized, disproportionate impact, or not disproportionate, just in the way we typically conceptualize. We think it'd level out, but it doesn't. It makes some interesting cases, some provocative cases. I didn't prepare to talk about all these little examples, but there's a competitive hockey league in Canada that's like ultra competitive, and you can predict from a young age when they start sorting them out, like a disproportionate amount are born in January, February, and March, and the leading players are mostly born in January, followed by February, and followed by March, and that's because that's the cutoff age is like January 1st. So your biggest players early on, they get sifted and coaches. They get better coaches, then they get more experience, and they play their games since they're like in the A League. They play more games, and then they end up pros. So you can actually see this, like, pros tend to be born in January, February, and March, and it really, obviously, being born in like December doesn't mean you're worse at hockey, or you just think it would just all level out, but it just sort of extends, and so that's sort of the case with if we're like a little behind, or maybe we're frustrated by it. Like, I was gonna read one more little paragraph, but the idea is that, well, it doesn't really matter, but like since the logic of Asian languages is embedded in the math, it just comes a little bit easier for like adding 22 plus 37. I have to really do some jumping through hoops in my head to decode that, whereas theirs is sort of embedded in the language. And so if they experience success and enjoy it more early on, have a better attitude toward it, and do a little better, they might get shifted into, or whatever, placed into a program that's better, and then that'll have
Yeah,
outsized.
I definitely agree with that. Like, there's a snowball effect, especially when it comes to attitude, and any stumbling block can potentially propagate through time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't dispute that. I also strongly believe that, your foundational years, like essentially from when you're born, uh, in your childhood, have a profound effect on where you end up. Like, it's very important that you get everything you need and experience a wide range of things, and get all your exposure and everything early. Like, that's very important, um, because otherwise it just takes more effort to overcome that. So I think you can overcome that if you're instilled with the proper values. Then even if you do experience, some slowness early, then you can overcome that. And I think historically, if Malcolm Gladwell were to run these experiments or try to collect these antidotes, 150 or 200 years ago, then maybe you would see some leveling out. But I think our society and culture has degraded to the point where we don't all hold those same values of hard work anymore, and so people are less likely to catch up if they're experiencing obstacles. That's my personal belief.
Yeah, I think there's some. I think there's probably a lot of truth to that actually. But I want to give you one more example of language encoding, like affecting memory. This is a shorter example, if you don't mind me reading it really quickly.
No.
So English speakers tend to phrase things in terms of people doing things, preferring transitive constructions like John broke the vase even for accidents. Speakers of Japanese or Spanish, in contrast, are less likely to mention the agent when describing an accidental event. In Spanish, one might say, Se rompió el florero, which translate. That's my best.
We should have got David. We should have got David to call in.
Just for that, like have him come in. And
You
guest
should
speaker.
have. You should have got him to record some Spanish and Japanese clips for me, so I would really understand.
But that would translate to the vase broke, or the vase broke itself if it's by accident.
Yeah.
So there were some studies that found that such linguistic differences influence how people construe what happened and have consequence for eyewitness memory. In a study published in 2010, speakers of English, Spanish, and Japanese watched videos of two guys popping balloons, breaking eggs, and spilling drinks, either intentionally or accidentally. Later, they gave them a surprise memory test, and for each event they had witnessed, they had to say which guy did it, just like in a police lineup. Another group of English, Spanish, and Japanese speakers described the same events. When they looked at the memory data, they found that the difference in eyewitness memory predicted by patterns in language. Speakers of all three languages described intentional events agentively, saying things such as he popped the balloon, and all three groups remembered who did these intentional actions equally well. When it came to accidents, however, interesting differences emerged. Spanish and Japanese speakers were less likely to describe the accidents agentively than were English speakers, and they correspondingly remembered who did it less well than English speakers did. This was not because they had poorer memory overall. They remembered the agents of intentional events for which their language would naturally mention the agent just as well as English speakers did. That's interesting to me.
So let me see if I understood that.
Yeah.
English speakers remembered who popped the balloon or broke the egg or spilled the drink even when it was accidental, but the
Yes,
other language
better.
people did not, because they don't characterize the subject in their language as often.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
term was agentively, which I had
Yeah.
not come across, and I actually looked it up.
When I was trying to learn Japanese before our trip to Japan years ago now, that was one thing that I noticed very commonly. The subject is dropped, and you just say, whatever happened.
If it was an accident, or just that would happen more frequently. So if
Very-
the plant fell over,
very commonly.
Bennett knocked over the plant.
Accidental. That doesn't ring any bells for me. There were no rules about accidentally. You can just very often drop the subject if it's obvious in context, I guess. Again, I only learned to the novice level, so I can't
Gotcha.
speak to the actual rules. We'd have to get a Japanese fourth grader on to tell us what the actual rules are. But yeah,
But
you can often drop
great
the
example
subject.
though. This is a great example of either whether it's culture or whatever, for whatever reason. This is what I don't know. Is Spanish and Japanese decide it's an accident, so we're not gonna blame quite as much the person who did the thing accidentally. Like the window was broken.
Yeah, the important part. The important part in the communication is that the window was broken, right? Not who accidentally broke the window necessarily. You could imagine an alternate language, an alien language or something. Maybe these aliens have 8 ears and they're arranged in a circle all the way around their face, right? They're sound based. They do everything based on sound. And they communicate what happened with like words about how intense the sound was. So
interesting.
if someone accidentally tore a Kleenex, I don't know, then then their verb for it might be like something that reflects a soft
Softly
sound.
tore,
But if someone broke a window, then their word might convey that it was louder, and so you might expect these aliens to perhaps remember louder events more than quieter events, right? Because they have ears all around their face, so that makes sense, right? That's more important to them.
Yeah. That's and that means because they would have the language. Let's say their memory for the purpose of this discussion are the same as ours. They're not super intelligent or anything. And then since they would record the soft tear or the loud crash of the window, their memory when they recall it would do that.
That's a key. It's a key to their memory.
things.
Well, it's the same thing. Like here's another thing I've thought of, and I'm sure linguists and other people who study this stuff as part of their career have thought of this much before. But when it comes to rhymes, jingles, mnemonic devices, memory keys. We all use those things, and in English, we certainly have those as well. But in other languages, like Japanese, for example, they have a more phonetically flat language. Basically, more things rhyme. Same with Spanish, because it's a gendered language. More things rhyme. They end in O or A, and therefore more things rhyme. So does that make jingles less special, right? Because more words can rhyme. It's harder to have a jingle stick in your memory, or a rhyme or a mnemonic device stick in your memory.
Or is the language more musical and you remember things better, generally speaking?
Could be.
Like that's the other side of that coin.
The other side. Here's something in Japanese that I was thinking. There are a prescribed number of phonemes, and again, this has been years since I learned the language, so I'm not going to be able to give a very high level of detail here. But there are like 6 or 7 different first letters that could potentially be the start of a word in Japanese, if we're talking phonetically. Whereas in English, we have combinations of letters that make different phonemes: th, ch, sh. Instead, as opposed to c, t, or s, right?
Right.
And so you can combine letters to get different sounds. So, like when you remember something by the first letter or the first sound of a word, which I often do, a lot of times when I'm trying to remember something, it starts with a T. What was it? It was his name. It starts with a T. It was a something. Theodore. That's it. Like, that happens to me all the time. I remember stuff by the first letter or first sound. Well,
how strange is that when you really think about it? It's interesting anyway.
It is strange. Well, in English, if we have a larger number of those starting sounds than in Japanese, which we do, then does that mean that I have a more granular memory when it comes to that sort of thing, right? Because
the Q is certainly more unique, right? The T is better information for you because it's more specific, I would think. You're limited in what you can rifle through.
That's exactly what I'm trying to express. Like, I have more options. So if I can remember the more granular option, I'm remembering, I have a 1 out of 35 chance of getting closer to the word now, whereas in Japanese I have a 1 out of 9 or whatever. Now, of course, none of this is to talk about the different alphabets. Like in Japanese, you have essentially 3 different alphabets. One for phonetically domestic words, the hiragana. One for imported words, but they're still written phonetically. Those are katakana. And then you have the kanji, which are Chinese characters. And those are the little pictures, right? The very complicated pictures that convey an idea. and there's
It
no.
sounds beautiful to me in theory that you have this like the alphabet is in itself artistic, right? Like it's symbolic.
It was fascinating because it's unique on Earth, essentially. Maybe there are some arcane examples, but it's the only still used pictographic language is Chinese.
That's a thrilling
the
idea,
kanji.
anyway. Yeah, pictographic. That's the word.
Right. Well, this ties in a little bit, at least tangentially, to the project that I did. It must have been a couple of years ago now, in a cognitive science class where we kind of took that idea and ran with it, the idea of a pictographic language, because I had the thought, well, emoji have really come onto the scene, a lot, and we're expanding the emoji library. There are hundreds, if not thousands, in your iPhone now. Are we turning into a pictographic society where we're using emoji to communicate? And we did an experiment to see if people could understand sentences of varying densities of emoji. It was fun.
I like that idea anyway, because I think you're 100% right that we are introducing more pictographs, if you will.
Yeah.
And that is becoming more and more the way we converse. And then how important is it to have nuance in those? And then and are the old people being I never got on board. I don't think you did either, right? In fact, we kind of smugly look down upon it and go, ugh, I mean, whatever. And so are we getting left out of some linguistic nuance to text?
I mean,
have you heard?
Undoubtedly. Yeah, undoubtedly we are. There are, maybe we can understand singular emoji, when they're used.
Yes.
Even though I can't often. I don't know what that upside down smiley face means. When people use that, I just ignore it. I'm like, I don't know what you're trying to convey with that.
Or even, have you heard punctuation, putting a period at the end of sentences comes across as aggressive and sarcastic?
Yeah, I've heard that before.
You're discontent. You can read articles on it. I actually printed one out for my students, and it's just, we discussed how this is interesting to me because grammar, punctuating correctly now can mean something different in a different medium and express something unintended. So now we have miscommunication going on, and it's bad.
Right.
I'm also interested. Well, go ahead.
I was just going to add on one thing. Maybe you and I can understand singular emoji, but they're compound.
Eggplant equals penis.
We understand eggplant equals penis, but what about eggplant plus little raindrops? Okay. Yeah, maybe you and I can put that together. Yeah, and a peach. Yeah. Right, maybe we can put that together. But there are others. There are lots of compound emoji words. Now, sentences, phrases.
Right, I certainly don't know them. When I just see them, it's just noise to me. Or if it's oh, congratulations, and people put a bunch of, the hats and the, I get it if you, but I'm assuming they're just sort of spamming.
Yeah, I don't even
put
read
the cake
them.
with the candles and no, I don't either. It's just noise to me, and it's
me too.
Should I be more intellectually curious if there is some consistency? I mean, it's an evolving thing. It's actually a neat thing to pay attention to, but I want it to be sent. Right now, I think we're in it's nonsense currently, and then it might have more rules in the future.
Here's the thought. So if we send ourselves back into the ancient times when, whoever Confucius or Sun Tzu or whoever was creating the Chinese language, Mao Zedong, whoever created Chinese.
Yeah, that's it.
When he was creating these little pictographs, you have to imagine that these things emerged slowly and broadly, and it only caught on when a wide number of people kind of collectively used them enough to where people could recognize them, right? In order for it to become a reliable form of communication, a lot of people had to understand it. And you didn't have one gatekeeper, even though I started my joke as if there were gatekeepers. You didn't have one singular gatekeeper for the addition of a new kanji into the language. But with emoji nowadays, you kind of do have gatekeepers, right? You have Apple, who decides whether or not to include it in iOS, and you have Google, who decides whether or not to include it in Android, or you have Microsoft or
the idea
Linux
of corporations sort of having an undue influence on evolving language and expression clearly they do. I mean,
Well, so like
yeah.
what made me think of this is because like I use Microsoft Teams for work all the time. That's what all our chats are, and they are continually updating it, of course, without our consent, and your computer restarts and it's really obnoxious. But anyway, they add new emoji all the time and remove old emoji all the time. And
Interesting.
and
Who's to say they could just remove your method of communication if that was your favorite thing to express a particular idea?
yeah. Well, we some coworkers have laughed when these new emoji get added because you get things like bearded woman. That's one that was posted, and it looks like I thought when I saw it and I didn't hover over it to see what the actual verbal explanation of it was. I thought it was Jesus. It looked like Jesus, and I was like, oh wow, they made a Jesus emoji. That's a little. I wouldn't have expected that from Microsoft. And then, of course, I hovered over it and saw a bearded woman and was like, oh, I see.
More,
This makes more sense now.
there's a political motivation to the emoji they're allowing.
Right.
Know?
Well, so that hilarious example aside, it's an interesting distinction from how I imagine, kanji developed. Right. Although there may actually be some history that I think I've
Well, it's
heard.
a more democratic process, almost certainly. But you're right. At some point, though, someone said, "I'm going to make the official one
Yeah.
currently. I'm going to publish the book on this." And then it was also down to instead of a whole corporation, which has a bunch of people probably, it's like three people writing this book, or scroll or whatever.
Right. Well, in Chinese, I don't. My Chinese history is not good, but like
Papyrus.
yeah, something with pirates. But like yeah, they have like simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese, and then Cantonese and Mandarin, and there's different. I think at some point they did kind of have to go back and make an official simplified Chinese language or something. I don't know the details of that history, so maybe someone did at some point say, okay, here are the real ones, and then you have these other ones kind of out on the fringe. So maybe there is a gatekeeper there.
What? This is a little bit of a different thought, but also how we, obviously different languages, we use different parts of our mouth, our tongue, and the tongue hits the different parts of the roof of our mouth and the
Mouth
guttural,
noises.
like just mouth noises, and so, and clearly the example that comes to mind is the L sound, la.
Yeah.
It is do Asian cultures can they hear us say la and they can't quite do it, or do they not hear it? And that's more interesting if they can't, if they're hearing, and if to them it sounds like they're saying ra back to us, and it sounds to them like they're saying what we're saying, and we're going no, not ra, la, and they go ra, and then you're just like, wait, are you not? What's
I think
happening?
they can hear it. I'm pretty sure they can hear it, but it's just that it's not a sound used in their language, and so they have no practice moving their mouth in that way. It takes practice to be able to pronounce it the correct way.
And it's so effortless for us.
Yeah, in the same way in Japanese, there's a character called Tsu, Tsu, Tsu. And there's also a Su, by the way,
Tsu,
Su. There's Su and Tsu, and they're different. And
So it's like Su versus Tsu or something like that. Is that coming across on the mic?
Su and Tsu. Yeah, I mean, you don't often say just that one character, just like we don't pronounce la, that often. But like you have words like Natsuki, which is I think summer, if I remember the word right, Natsuki, and it's 3 characters, right? Na, tsu, ki, and we can pronounce it. We see that word and we go Natsuki, with a little bit of an accent added in, Natsuki, but they don't say it like that in Japanese. They say Natsuki, and it's got a different pronunciation. Even my pronunciation is bad, I'm sure, but we don't have that. We don't exactly have that same sort of sound. So that's how I imagine it is between la and ra, for example. They don't have la. Although in Japanese in particular, since they have so many imported words from English, I imagine a lot of, there's a lot of people can say L words in Japanese, even if it's a little awkward.
It's less interesting, yeah, if they really can hear it. But what if, to what extent if our muscles aren't trained, whether it's our tongue muscles or our ear muscles, what if it's just not, we're not intaking it correctly? I don't know. That would be fascinating.
That could be too. Like there are probably obscure African tribal languages, that use like glottal stops and like guttural gluglugs and whatever other kinds of things there are. And if we heard a sentence or even a single word in that language, our takeaway, because we don't understand it, might just be, that's weird. Like, I don't understand that. It sounded like fnagklog. Like that's what it sounds like in English. But in reality, if we said that back to them, they would laugh and they would say, no, it's whatever, with some other with some other special mouth noises in there that we didn't even register because we don't.
Yeah, it's totally. Yeah.
We don't recognize them as things. In the same way, the aliens with the ears around their face, if they tried to translate something in their language into English, it might be really difficult because we have no concept of the volume of what they're trying to refer to, the tissue ripping or the window breaking. They might have to add in additional English words that convey the intensity of what they're trying to communicate.
So
I really hope those aliens exist because I kind of like the idea.
I like the idea of ears all around, and that really got me thinking about how cultural values are, or alien values, I suppose, are baked into the language that we have because it's what we value, and that's how we record things. And
well, we obviously want to communicate what we value. Otherwise, we wouldn't communicate it if it's not valuable. And so, our values are inherently tied to what we communicate.
You can take it in funny directions. If there was a very judgy, culture that valued looks, that was a primary value. And
right.
So,
there's a
one
different
culture says the lamp was broken, the other says ugly Bennett broke the lamp. And they go, who broke it? That ugly guy, Bennett.
Oh yeah, it was someone ugly. I don't remember who it was, but it was someone ugly. Yeah. I mean, that's plausible. Again, to go back to Japanese, they're they're a culture that honors elders and has different rules about politeness and so on. And so there are a lot of different honorifics in the language to refer to, a respected elder, a respected grandfather, a respected father, a respected stranger. There are a lot of different ways to refer to people, parents, teachers, and so on. Whereas we don't have as many distinctions because we don't consider that hierarchy as rigidly.
Yes, and that's another part of Outliers is there are plane crashes, and like Korea had a lot of plane crashes for a while, and part of that was because the co-pilot would not challenge, it was a very interesting chapter of how you spoke to different people, and the only way you could challenge is you could make a mild suggestion. Right. And that might not be picked up on depending. It's just a lot more polite. So then even listening, I read transcripts of the Korean exchange among the pilot and the co-pilot, and it would not read like I guess someone tuned in and paying attention and knows Korean culture would say, wow, this underling is really doing their best within the confines of the culture to suggest they need to do something, but just can't quite bring himself, and the plane freaking crash. It's tragic knowing he's just like, we should really, there is ice on the wings, like we should maybe perhaps consider checking that out. Whereas I think we have we have less strict hierarchies, and we're encouraged. So American pilots are like the safest in the world, not because and it gets into this. It's
because we're jerks to each other because we don't respect our bosses.
Yes. I mean, it's one way of saying it. It's not that we're more talented all of this either.
That's the distinction. That's the cultural distinction, right? That I mentioned earlier about being more community focused or more individual focused. And we're more individual focused, so we don't have as much problem pointing out the flaw of a superior because we're not as concerned. You want to know something interesting? Then
the Korean air that would lost some status. I don't have all the stats in front of me. They were people were American. People were starting to criticize them heavily. They had a bunch of planes go down and all of this, and So the solution actually was to adopt English language and some protocol that says this is you're kind of forced to do this. But just by like saying you got to speak English in the cockpit and like communicate this way, it bypassed some of the culture that was baked into the language. And I thought that was like, wow, this is super interesting.
That is really interesting. Do you think that there's been an idea pushed, as we become more of a uniform global society, for better or worse, there's a push to make a global language, really, to use English, for example, as the global language. And, there's also a kind of related push in individual countries for people to be bilingual, trilingual, or multilingual in some way. It's more common in Europe than it is in the US. Do you think it's a good thing? It's a better thing for citizens of a country or citizens of the world, if you want to use that phrase, to stick to one language and be very proficient in it, or to be multilingual? Which do you think is better?
I mean, I only speak one language and I regret it because I think learning a different language is not just like we started off the conversation saying it's not just you've learned a bunch of synonyms and they happen to be Spanish words, and now I know how Spanish works. It's like I assume I would learn the idiomatic expressions. I would start to understand some things. I probably wouldn't even understand I'm learning some expressions until later on in mastering the language and going, oh, now I see why they tell time in a little bit different way, or their language, their number system is a little more logical or whatever. So I think it would expand my mind. So on the individual level, I think it expands your mind because to learn different languages is to peek into different cultures in a deeper way. So you get to understand more of humanity the more languages you acquiesce. But in theory, us all speaking the same language is it sounds like end of days type rhetoric, like where we all like try to build a Tower of Babel to the heavens, and we all like come together. Like, I don't know. There's something eerie from a literary perspective, not necessarily a logical one, because I think logically it's like, it would cut down on a lot of miscommunication, and we could all focus on refining one language. But if language is imperfect, if that's our hypothesis, which I think I agree with, language is imperfect, I like the idea of there being multiple languages, because that means they're gonna emphasize different. Yeah, they're emphasizing different elements, and then we learn.
That's a baseball analogy, by the way.
Yeah, covering all the bases.
Or military. I don't know which one actually.
I don't know. When do you cover bases? I guess like. Oh, if you're defensively making sure you're like paying attention to the runners, so you're making sure you cover them all.
Yeah, stupid.
I didn't. Well, at first I was just like, do you put like
obviously
it's starting to rain? It's hurry up, everyone cover all the bases. It's raining, and then you go and get a tarp and you cover them. But I just think that is. I think it would be foolhardy to try and say everyone speak English or everyone speak.
Yeah, I tend
some new language.
Yeah, I tend
to. That?
Yeah, right. Pig Latin. Yeah, I tend to agree with you in that respect. Like, I think a one world language is a pretty bad idea. And I also agree that on an individual level, it's fun and even useful to learn other languages. Like, not only does it stretch your mind, give you a little bit greater context, allow you to potentially communicate even badly with people who speak other languages, and maybe clue you into some other, like you say, colloquialisms and idioms and that sort of thing.
Cultural insights, even, yeah.
So all of that is positive. What do you think about, like, for example, some states and jurisdictions in the United States have two official languages, English and Spanish. Do you think it's important that people, for example, who immigrate to the U.S. learn English? Or, for example, if you were to move to Germany or Japan, should it be incumbent on you to learn the language there or not?
I think it should be. I think at some point you're going to say, hey, I'm moving to a place, and this place has a culture. And we've talked about the inextricable nature of language and culture, and I think you just have to say, we have
Yeah.
I understand also if you have a lot of Hispanic people, then you might as a business make the decision to print out like in Spanish and in English for practical reasons. I totally like no whatever, but culturally, like we just need to say. I think it's just common sense to say to have an official language and that just be like and to say, hey, we're gonna like. I can understand, like, we're going to welcome those since we understand a lot of our population speaks Spanish. Let's make this amenable to them while encouraging them to speak English. You know, I think you can invite people, like if I moved to Germany and I said, this is where I'm going to live the rest of my life, but I'm not going to learn German, it would be a little like, wait, what?
Right.
Why are you moving there? What's the point? If I'm going to live there for a year, that's a different story.
Right.
Like, I'm not going to learn German. I might pick up on some German. I'm going to be curious about German, but I'm not going to invest the same amount of effort. But I couldn't go in there and insist them that they all speak English or something. Like, that would be arrogant, I think.
Right.
Is what I would say.
Right.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. It just gets it gets complicated, I guess, because, well, it gets into a whole other topic about immigration. Like, you know, if you have a whole lot of people moving somewhere, there's a balance between assimilation and like cultural assimilation, and I guess what your policy is, right? So you could criticize some of the southwestern U.S. states, you know, for making Spanish part of their official language, or, you know, all the businesses for putting it on their signs and everything. You could criticize them and say, you know, what are you doing? Like, you know, English is our official language, and if you immigrate here, you should learn English. Although that's not necessarily practical, because, you know, a significant portion of their customers might not speak English. They haven't yet assimilated, and so, you know, it doesn't make business sense for them to restrict their signage into only being English. And then you have to ask the question from the higher up, more abstract level. Okay, well, if people aren't assimilating, does that mean we have too much immigration? Are too many people, like, our assimilation rate is too low, right?
Yes.
Like, especially, this is particularly notable for America because, you know, we are, you know, as people like to say, a nation of immigrants. And so we've had immigration throughout our entire history. And, you know, you and I both, our ancestors came from elsewhere, and at some point immigrated to the U.S. and adopted the American culture, even if we might have English-speaking ancestors anyway. But the assimilation rate was such that no matter who moved to the United States, they basically assimilated and onboarded American culture and language. But, you know, in recent decades, the assimilation rate seems to have gone down, and I guess the immigration rate has gone up, and those things probably have some correlation or some causation, I should say.
Yeah, and I mean, we should have a healthy discussion around what does it mean to assimilate, what do we expect, and what should your goals be if you want to move here to stay here, and what are our values, and like I guess that's what political discourse is in general. But if our values, if we have American values, then we have American language. We have English,
I speak American.
You know?
Don't you? You're an American teacher, for goodness sake.
And so, yeah, are we okay just saying, like, you know, we speak English, like this is our language. Now we acknowledge this particular town on the border, or we acknowledge in order to function, well, but like if you started, it's like, is there a line to draw? Like, okay, fine, we'll make sure the pharmacy has clear labels and other things. But we're not, you know, and if the business wants to print a menu in a different language, like, fine. But if you start putting up big billboards or your signage is in a different language, like, well, should we regulate against that, or should we just let the market decide?
Right? That's the question. Know? And because assimilation is important, like it is an important issue to think about for the future of the country, and at some point you do have to say, wait, we can't, you know, if you move here, you should learn English. You know, I would expect if I moved to Japan, not speaking Japanese or being able to read Japanese, I would have a hard time. And I wouldn't like go into the DMV or the Japanese equivalent of the DMV and expect to be able to just do everything in English, right? I wouldn't expect that. I would feel like, oh yeah, I don't know Japanese. I'm sorry. I guess I'll come back later when I do. And I would expect to face barriers, and that seems appropriate to me to feel that way, to feel on the outs a little bit until you can speak the language.
And what's interesting, I think modern tech might slow down the incentives to learn.
Exactly.
So if you get there and you
Yes.
can translate it quickly or hold up an app or something.
Or
and go, well,
where
I
my
really need to learn Japanese.
where my Apple, whatever the new Apple AR
Yeah.
$5,000 doohickey is, and it just
3,500, a cool 35.
it just translates all of the language in front of me, so I can read it. Basically, getting into Star Trek.
And then I talk
territory.
and it just puts. Well, AI will actually, if you put in enough stuff, it can imitate your voice. So
Yeah.
then not only can I have it spit it out in Japanese, it would be my voice speaking in
Yeah,
Japanese.
that's pretty cool.
It's really. So why learn another language ever? Why
Well,
assimilate
so-
to a culture ever? Well, because you live there and you want to be part of the culture. That's the idea. Is that people moving to a place should want to live in
Yes.
that place for a reason,
Yeah,
and
that's
that's
true.
because, and it's not because the soil is a particularly
At
cool
a different
feel to it.
latitude and longitude.
Yeah, I mean, weather is one reason, but like, come on, you really, so it should be because, hey, I enjoy what you got going on here. Like
Yeah.
if I moved to Japan, it would be because I liked the orderliness, I
Right,
liked
right.
the politeness, I liked, and holistically
KFC.
I'm buying in. So yeah, delicious KFC.
They
and,
love KFC in Japan. I don't know what it stands for. It must stand for like
KFC
Kanto fried chicken or some Japanese word, I'm sure.
It's more popular outside of the States. than it is inside.
Kawaii fried chicken. That must be it. I don't want to kick us off on a whole other topic, but I just have a thought. Maybe we can close with
Yeah,
this thought. So you were talking about why learn another language if AI can translate the words for us that we see visually and we can speak, and it will translate our voice vocally into the other language. What about these nooks and crannies about the idea, how we represent the thoughts in language, all the stuff we started the conversation talking about, the difference between the redneck's vocabulary and how that matches to his
The
internal
nuance.
feelings, nuance, and the academic. And, then when you go cross-culturally, it gets even more complicated because you have your Japanese rednecks and your Japanese academics and, you have the different subcultures within other languages. Will the AI, well, obviously not initially, it wouldn't be able to represent that stuff. Will it get to the point where it can even represent that nuance? Will we get to the point where where the Apple thing will have some electrodes on your temples and it can read, your brain waves, your beta waves and alpha waves and all that stuff, and know what you're feeling? It'll know the attitude with which you're generating the words that you're speaking. And then it'll do that translation into the language for you.
I think it could, because I think you can say to ChatGPT right now, like, you take whatever piece of writing and say, but make it silly and playful with some jokes thrown in, and it will. So I think I could imagine you go to Japan, you see a cute girl, and instead of like, you say, ask her name,
But
make
do it
funny.
flirtily. Do it.
Yeah, do it in a flirty
do it
fashion
in
and
a
make it
flirty
funny.
way.
And then it just goes, and it takes your voice, and it says, you're not even sure what it says.
Yeah,
but
right.
But you trust that it's communicating in a flirty way.
Well, that's the
And
thing.
so-
Think about this. It's reading your brainwaves. You're not instructing it to be flirty, but you're thinking.
knows you wanna
you're
be flirty.
thinking the thoughts in a flirty
It's measured
way.
a little blood going to your
Yeah,
penis.
yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
oh,
yeah.
you're attracted to this person, so I'm gonna do. And I happen to know this person too, that they like silliness, so I'm going to make this silly, even though you didn't tell it to be silly. Or it likes,
Right, well-
or this girl likes, intellectualism, so I'm gonna beef up the language.
Well, yeah. Imagine you're doing your study abroad program and you're waiting tables at a restaurant to make extra money while you're doing your study abroad program, and a really fat, smelly person comes in and sits at your table, and you're a little disgusted at that. But they speak another language, and you go greet them, and you say, welcome to our restaurant, sir. What would you like to drink? But the AI interprets your disgust and disappointment and everything, and communicates that to them in whatever language. I don't know. This is totally ridiculous to speculate on, but I just find that really a really interesting thought and hilarious idea, and I guess a pitfall that we'll experience if this comes to be.
Oh man.
What was
Yeah.
the word that I used for describing nonverbal communication? Extra
X word.
extra word extra wordle. That's what it was, right? Extra wordle communication. That's gonna be the title for this
That's a good one.
podcast.
Okay.
Goodbye.
We're done.
Sayonara.
Bye. Do-do-do-do-do-do.
Over.